Detention hearing was postponed for Massachusetts Air National Guardsman Jack Teixeira, accused of leaking highly classified military documents, but he did appear in a Boston courtroom. Western Mass News reporter Kristen Burnell joins us live in the studio with the latest. Kristen?
Matt, the arrest of 21-year-old Jack Teixeira of North Dighton in the spotlight again after his scheduled detention hearing on Wednesday was postponed.
He waived his rights to a probable cause hearing. And then his lawyer stepped in and said that he needed about 2 weeks to be able to prepare his case. He needed to look at the evidence that the U.S. government had that justified holding the airmen in custody until he goes to trial.
The National Guard airmen first appeared before a judge last Friday after his arrest on Thursday in connection with the leak of highly classified military documents on the social media platform Discord. Western Mass News spoke with retired U.S. Army officer Gary Lafort. We asked him what this request to delay the detention hearing means.
So I don't think that that's necessarily unpredictable, especially considering that we've had less than a week than this is all unfolded. So far, no date has been set for the detention hearing, and he has also not pleaded to any of the two charges that have been brought against him.
Investigators say Teixeira specialized in intelligence with his role as a cyber defense operations journeyman at Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts. He was granted a top-secret security clearance in 2021 and maintained sensitive access to other highly classified programs.
Not only about the Ukraine operation, divulging information of the upcoming Ukraine counteroffensive, which is supposed to start soon. There's also indication that some of the documentation might have referred to whether or not Putin was willing to use nuclear weapons.
But he tells us what raises the biggest concern about the leak of the classified documents.
The fact that classified documentation was released that was received by the United States from its allies and partners. And that raises a real concern that in the foreseeable future, these allies and partners may be a little reluctant in what they release to the United States as far as intelligence information.
Now, as I mentioned, Teixeira's attorney requested that detention hearing be postponed for 2 weeks, but an exact date has not been set yet. Reporting live in studio, Kristen Burnell, Western Mass News.